So teasing is a consistent issue for both talent and programmers. And Mike and Andy and I all work with a lot of shows, and we find this to be consistently one of the problems. We've got a lot of program directors who tell their talent that we want you to tease. We think it's a good idea to tease, so start teasing more. But a lot of times they don't know how to coach the teasing, or they don't have the techniques to do it. So a couple of questions before we get started, guys. When should these teases be prepped, and what's the importance of teasing on a contemporary radio show today?
I think they should be prepped when you're doing your show prep. And I'm a big believer in prepping as far in advance as possible. So if a lot of that can be done the day before, that's best. We're planning on doing all this day of is putting a lot on yourself.
Absolutely. I think the worst time to figure out what your tease is the song is fading and you got to do that tease. And we worked with some shows initially that's exactly how they did them. But to Andy's point, as part of the show prep discipline, go ahead and prep those teases and prep them out as content. Make them entertaining in and of themselves. We find that shows that do a really good job with creative teases and making them content have perceptual research scores that just show the show itself sounds fuller and more content rich.
That's one of the side benefits of it. The teasing really is content itself, and it makes the show sound a lot more robust, as long as that tease doesn't sound like a commercial. So as programmers are asking and demanding more teasing, but they don't know how to tease, what's the let's get started with creating some teases. So for the viewers, I've got some content here that Mike and Andy haven't seen yet. So I'm going to put you guys, I've seen it. I've got the advantage because I created this. So I've already got my tease ready to go. But I'm going to give you guys some content. And the first one comes from a show that I worked with earlier this week. I was on with them yesterday. And this is a feature that the show does called What's Your Next Move? The feature is a listener dilemma. Listener calls up and says, I've got this problem. I don't know what to do. Show diagnoses the problem, talks it out, takes calls from listeners, and suggests a course of action. It's kind of like a group therapy or a lot of the relationship features that you hear on a lot of shows. So here's the background of what happened on this episode of What's Your Next Move? A guy called in and said he was at the doctor for a routine visit. He's always had a crush on this doctor. It's a female doctor, always had a crush on her. And he has thought that she kind of likes him too, but he wasn't sure. So during the course of the examination, he cracks a joke and she giggled, then touched his arm and said, "It's always so good to see you." Then she left, went on to another patient. He thinks it's a signal to make a move and he doesn't know what to do. So as Mike and Andy start to work on what their teases are, we're going to critique this here in just a sec while they're working on some ideas, and then I'll show you what my idea is, and we'll break it down. So here's what the show teased. They said, coming up, what's your next move? Dusty thinks he's in love with his doctor. We'll talk about it next. It's all the facts. That's exactly what we're going to do. They laid it out. They got all the information in there, but it's not particularly compelling or sexy, is it? So first of all, saying coming up, well, coming up when? Coming up in the next 3 hours before the show is over, coming up in the next 5 minutes, coming up in the next 20 minutes. When's the appointment? Also, why say coming up at the beginning of a talk break? Hook me on it first. I've never seen an infomercial come on at the beginning of an infomercial start with, hey, coming up, we're going to tell you this. They just come in and tell you and get it out there right away. Another key principle, and we've talked about this in the Art of the Tease seminars that a lot of you have probably seen, starting with the feature is not a particularly good idea. Coming up, what's your next move? Let's put that back at the end and let's hook them on the storyline. Dusty. Well, who's Dusty? Well, he's some listener. He thinks he's in love with his doctor. Why does he think he's in love with his doctor? We'll talk about it next. Okay, so it's got the facts right, but it's not particularly exciting. So Andy and Mike, how are you guys doing? You got yours?
I've got one.
Yeah.
So I kind of think the hook is Dusty's pretty sure his doctor has a crush on him. So thinking backwards to tease to that hook. What about Dusty thinks his longtime secret crush is finally sending him signals because of a laugh and an arm touch. Do you agree? And if so, what should he do? What's your next move coming up after Dua Lipa?
Awesome. She touched his arm. He thinks it's a sign. He doesn't know what to do. What should Dusty do? That's on what's your next move coming up after Dua Lipa. Love it. Love it.
Okay, I got, hey, listener Dusty has always had a secret crush on his doctor, and now he needs a little relationship advice after an especially touchy-feely encounter at his last appointment. Can we help him out? Dusty's coming up on group therapy this morning at 7:05 here on Mix 99.9.
Awesome. See, both of those a lot more colorful, right? And I think that you can see that. And one of the things you'll notice is crafting a good tease like this doesn't mean it's going to be shorter or tighter, because this tease from the show did was short, it was tight, it was not that many words, there's no wasted words there, but it just wasn't very compelling. Both Andy and Mike's tease that they created is a little bit longer, and it takes a little bit longer to get that hook in. So let me tell you the one that I came up with. My tease is, Dusty says he's in love with his doctor and he thinks there's a spark because she laughed at one of his jokes and touched his arm. He needs advice. He's on the next episode of What's Your Next Move after Taylor Swift on Mix 99. So there you go. Very similar to what you guys came up with. Almost exactly the same. Okay, now if you are in the chat and you want to put some of your teases and some of your tease ideas for this content up in the chat box, we'd love to see that as well. Go ahead and type that in, and we'll share that with the group. Here's a phone topic. Now, this is from our Personality Magnet show prep service, which if you're not a subscriber, you should be. It's just $24 a month at personalitymagnet.com. This is a piece of content that's in there for this week. It was about a concert that Justin Timberlake is on tour right now. And the phone topic that the show is going to is, there was a concert last night. Justin Timberlake performed, and it was awesome. But why do you think he doesn't play old NSYNC songs? I mean, Paul McCartney sings Beatles songs. Beyonce does Destiny's Child songs. I don't get it. Is he embarrassed about it? So this is a topic that the show has curated into content. They know what they're going to do with it. They're asking questions if Justin Timberlake is embarrassed about his history with NSYNC. So that's a good setup for the topic. Now we want to write a tease that's going to come before that to get me to the segment. So Mike, Andy, go at it. Lot to work with there. You could start with the artists. You could start with set lists about the concert experience. You could pick one thing. One of the principles of good teasing is to isolate one thing, the most compelling aspect of the content, and make that the essence of the tease, of where you're going with it. Remember, there's a difference between the tease and the hook. The tease is to get a listener to a segment. The hook is to get them through the segment and point to the next and point to the payoff.
Mike, you want to go first, or you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I kind of think the hook is the Justin Timberlake embarrassed by his NSYNC days. So my tease to that would be, JT played last night and it was incredible, but apparently I'm not the only one embarrassed by some of the things I did when I was a teenager. Coming up in 6 minutes.
Awesome. I agree with Andy exactly that's the hook in the bit. I decided to use a question to start my hook out with what does Justin Timberlake have to hide? Well, he performed last night at the arena. The concert was fantastic, but something was missing. Something he might be just a little embarrassed about. We're going to tell you what Justin left out of his performance and why next on Mix 99.9.
Awesome. Similar, pointing toward the same thing. Mine's similar too. I turned up the volume on personality a little bit more with this one. I'm using the personalities Peppy and Zippy, which is my placeholder for DJs on radio shows. So here's my tease. Peppy says that Justin Timberlake played last night, loved the concert, was at the arena, it was spectacular, but she says he should be embarrassed. In fact, she says he is embarrassed and he hasn't admitted it yet. And there may even be some mental problems. Find out why next with Peppy and Zippy on the Big Frog 92.1. So when you get into exploring it, if you're embarrassed about your past and the most popular time, or arguably the most popular time of your career, when you were in that boy band, it can kind of point towards some mental health issues. Why is he hiding this? What's he pointing to? And of course, you're not going to explore mental health in that segment. A couple of them coming in on the chat box. Why has Justin Timberlake kissed his NSYNC days bye bye bye? Good. I like the play on words. Just make sure that when you're creating a tease, you don't craft it all around play on words. But that Kevin, that's a good one. I like that. Okay, next one is also from Personality Magnet this week. One of the pieces of content is a phone topic suggestion about reasons that people have for walking out on a first date. And for those of you who aren't on and haven't seen Personality Magnet, when we craft the content in Personality Magnet, not only do we tell you what you can do with it and throw the topic out there, we also provide some content, like a list of different reasons that people have for walking out on the first date that you can use to plant phone calls or use them as texts or as conversation starters to get the bit going. So in Personality Magnet, there's a list of these reasons that people have for walking out on a first date. When you perform it on the air, don't use the list. Use the list as a reference point, but don't use the list to perform it. Andy, Mike, you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, I started off with a declaration on this one. There's a lot of different ways you could handle this particular tease, but I started off with it's official. There are 3 things about dating that you really need to know, at least if you don't want your first date with someone to be your last. I'll share all 3 with you right after Harry Styles here on Mix 99.9. Now, qualifier on this is that there was a qualifier in the tease. That we assume that people are interested in dating, but you wanted to get to the point and get somebody's attention there right out off the bat.
So another thing you could do with that, if you're going to start a list, and I like that you narrow that to the 3 things on the list. One of the things you could do in that tease is to give 2 of the 3 things and kind of count it down and leave that mystery there, that suspense, because it opens the curiosity gap with the listener. You could say we have a list of the reasons that the most popular, most common reasons that people walk out on a first date. Number 3 is this, number 2 is that. And you're not going to believe what number 1 is. And then continue with the tease exactly the way that you set that up. It creates some mystique. And once you start that countdown and you have people guessing what the top spot is, they're much more likely to stay on. So instead of just saying, here's the top 3, leave some mystery of what number 1 might be.
Kind of gamify it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's mine. So my angle on this was a bad date, a personal bad date story. So my tease to that was, once on a first date, the girl unexpectedly showed up with her mom tagging along as a chaperone. Coming up in 3 minutes, I'll tell you what I did, and we'll talk about some of the top reasons to walk out on a first date.
Awesome. Love it. So here's mine. Peppy's going on a first date this weekend, and it's at least 50-50 she's going to walk out on her date, because this just keeps happening. It's how she is. She's a little high maintenance. Help us decide if her reasons for bailing on a first date make sense, or if she's just over the top and is undateable. All right. So once again, I'm putting the personality more in the center of it and building it around a possible story. Okay. Here's a music feature. This will look familiar to a lot of shows. You're going to play a 90s classic song for your 90s flashback feature. It's scheduled every day at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the song you're going to play is You Ought to Know by Alanis Morissette. It's coming up after the stop set to kick off the workday with 90 minutes of commercial-free music. How do you promote it? What's your tease on this? And I'll give you a sneak peek on my tease. I'm going to gamify the heck out of this one. I'm creating a full-on game to make you start guessing along with me on this one. So there's a lot of different types of teases. If you've seen our Art of the Tease seminars, or if you have the Art of the Tease ebook that just came out a couple of weeks ago, we go through call it the gallery of teases. And it's got how to use audio in a tease. It's got how to gamify it, how to open that curiosity gap, and how to create intrigue for the content that's coming up. And for a music feature, and you're playing a song, I call it channeling your inner Casey Kasem, and make me curious about something and want the answer to something that I probably don't even care about. So, Andy, do you have yours?
Okay.
I didn't give you much time. I know.
No, but luckily I like that song. So a song that Alanis Morissette fans have long suspected she wrote about her relationship with Full House actor Dave Coulier, aka Uncle Joey, after the pair dated for 2 years back in the early 90s, is coming up in 4 minutes.
Awesome. You're telling me a story. So one thing you could do with that is leave the story unfinished. So
be vague on who the guy is.
Yeah, who's the guy and what was the relationship, and leave one aspect of the story out, and then use the song as the cherry on top of that. But yeah, I love that. I can't believe you know that about Alanis Morissette. That's amazing.
I'm a fan.
There you go. Okay. I kind of gamified mine a little bit. Casey Kasem it a little bit. Now we're assuming that because this is a feature on the station, that most of the audience are in fact 90s fans. So here's what I came up with. Quick question for all the 90s fans. If I asked you to name one of the biggest hit songs from 1995, performed by a female artist, and I told you she recorded it with 2 members of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, could you name that soon? Let's find out. We'll play that classic 90s flashback next, as well as we launch into the 90s, 90-minute commercial-free workshop here on Mix 99.9.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. You have me playing along and guessing along with that. So that's terrific. Okay, I had an advantage here because I knew what the content was, and I could do some research on it. So I did research this and put a little Casey into it, and you'll hear, to Mike's point earlier, he talked about teases are also content, and they can make the show sound more robust. And that's what I did with this one. There was a lot going on this week in the 90s. You remember the 90s, right? I mean, this was a crazy week. What year were all of these things happening this week? Everybody was talking about O.J. Simpson's trial, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Neil Young performed with Pearl Jam in Austria. And Jaws dropped over the first prototype of a flat screen TV. What year was it? Was it 1993, 1995, or 1997? I've got the answer and the hottest song in the world from a young Canadian singer that was taking over the pop charts this week in that year. Next, as we start 90 minutes commercial-free workday with the 90s flashback song on the Big Frog. So a little longer, it gets everything in. But the idea is, let's give them some content and get them thinking. What year was this song from? We tease them with, it's a Canadian singer, but we give them 3 events that happened in that year. Oh, and by the way, here's the #1 song. So when we come back after the commercials to kick off the commercial-free workday, we repeat the question. What was happening this week in this year? Repeat the 3 things. What year was it? Well, if you said it was 1995, you're right. And #1 on the charts this week in 1995 was Alanis Morissette from Canada. Here's You Ought to Know to kick off commercial-free workday. So you're creating a game, and you don't even need a prize to pay it off. But you're just intriguing the audience just a little bit, and all it takes is a little bit to open that curiosity gap that we talked about.
And to Mike's point from earlier, that's almost impossible to do as the song's fading. Not coming up with that. But if you do it in your show prep, you can come up with teases like that.
Yeah, and by the way, I've got that. That's one of the first questions that I've got here that came out. I had several people who weren't going to be able to make it live to the workshop today, and they sent some questions in. So we're going to get to that in a second. But yeah, you're right, Andy, and that's why making teases part of your prep and prepping in advance is really, really important. So the first question I had, in fact, was how can you prepare teases in advance if the show doesn't prep until the day of the show or just before the show goes on? So,
well, there's your problem.
Right. So what do you say to shows that think that they can't prep until the morning of because we don't know what's going to happen the night before, and we've got to be right on top of everything and be really immediate? How would you respond to that?
That most of the really big shows have the majority of their show planned before they walk in that next day. In my experience, I don't know about you guys, but
yeah,
I mean, that's
absolutely.
What I see.
And you know, very few things in reality are that urgent that they have to be prepped the morning or fleshed out the morning of. In fact, as we've discussed with some of our clients, many times it's better to let something rest for a day,
marinate,
let the audience get fully familiar with the story, whatever the topical story is, and prep something that's really meaningful and compelling rather than just jumping on and talking about whatever the topic is.
Yeah, because we always say choose content you can add to, and you can't add to it if you're just coming up with it spur of the moment.
Yeah. We coach our clients to stay ahead, even as much as a week in advance in planning your show sheet. Because I mean, if you really look at it, how much of your show is immediate anyway? Anything that happens in the world. I mean, when Queen Elizabeth died the other day, how long was it before you knew that Queen Elizabeth died? 5 minutes, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're not breaking news in most cases. Now, when something like that happens, you probably want to reflect it on the show the next day, but it's easy to make an adjustment in the show plan the morning of if the entire show is already planned and prepped, and you can just take one of those segments out that's evergreen and move it to a different show. So one of the things that we like to do is, and this is explained in detail in the Prep Like a Pro seminar that you can get if you're an insider. It's on demand, or you can go to tjohnsonmediagroup.com and get it too. But we advise shows to plan further out, even as much as a week in advance, and lay out that skeleton, slot in the evergreen things that you're planning to do, slot in the things that you know are going to be happening in your market, in your community, and plan those things. That way you're not scrambling to create. If you're on 4 hours a day, doing 4 breaks per hour, you're creating 16 pieces of original content per day. That's a ton. And you just get off a show and you're exhausted, you're mentally exhausted, and it's emotionally exhausting. And now you got to prep another show for tomorrow. That's where this job starts to become a grind. Yeah. So you can take that grind out of it by working farther ahead, having a lot of that slotted in. And show prep, like Mike always says to our clients, it shouldn't be like doing taxes or going to the dentist. Show prep actually should be a fun process that is interactive and collaborative, and you have a good time creating content that you're looking forward to performing that next day.
Yeah, and the Queen is a great example, because if you have 80% of your show already planned, when something like that happens, you can spend that time coming up with an angle for that. So you're not just relaying the information, like you said, that everybody's already heard. If you're on a music station, you're finding a way to relate it to concerts that she went to or musicians that she knighted. Or if you're on a sports station, her tie into sports through her horse racing and polo and all that stuff.
Right. So we're talking about prep here, which is a sidebar from teasing. But what would you tell your clients about talking about Queen Elizabeth the next day? Because I got 4 calls on Thursday last week saying, "How do I cover this story?" What were you telling your clients?
Well, I first of all, to your point, we're not really covering the story. Most of our clients are not news stations. They're entertainment shows. And so we can't out news. We can't, as you point out, everybody on their phone knew within 5 minutes that she had passed. So the first thing that I recommend is that we look for an angle to talk about the Queen's passing, but we're not covering it. It's not a new, it's not that we're going live, to the palace right now to see what the latest is.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. It's all about finding your angle, and you start with personal or local. If the Queen happened to come to your area, if you've ever been to Buckingham Palace, that's a tie-in. But if you have none of those work, then you move on to a format tie-in, like I was saying with, she did knight a lot of artists over the years. She went to a lot of concerts. She went to some sporting events here in the U.S. I heard a sports station here locally that did a great tease to talking about the Queen because she had and talked about sporting events she'd gone to,
I had two that I wanted to share. One was Alex Taylor, who does nights on K-Love, the Christian network. She was talking about one of the things on her bucket list was to meet Queen Elizabeth. And that was inspired because many years ago, she was in a place completely by coincidence. And Prince Harry got out of a limo near her and came over and took the time to come over and shake hands with her, take a picture with her, and just made her feel like a queen. So it was her brush with royalty, and it gave her a chance to tell that story that she's never had a chance to tell on the air before.
Yeah.
So she took something that was relevant and happening in the world and turned it into a personal story. And the other was my favorite. It's Mary O'Brien, who is on nights on Air One, also an EMF Christian network. She came on Thursday night last week and said everybody is talking about the Queen and their memories and 70 years legacy. She's seen a lot of things, she's done a lot of things, and she's been involved with a lot of things, but nobody's really talking about the void that leaves behind in the family. Can you imagine someone who has had that much presence and that much influence over the entire family and the hole that leaves with them right now? And then she made it personal to the audience, and she turned that into the hole that's left in your life when something is taken away from you, and how you fill that void, and took some phone calls on that. I thought it was absolutely brilliant the way that she took something that was relatively generic that everybody else was talking about, and she made it personal.
Yeah.
Comment is from Y107, say, keep your appointment sets fresh and different. Don't always say in 5 minutes, come up with different ways to say it. And you're exactly right. There's if you get the book, Art of the Tease, which you can get now at tjohnsonmediagroup.com, we've got a list of different ways that you can say that, and when you should say in 6 minutes and in 7 minutes, and when you should set the time with a specific timestamp on it. And some rules of thumb that you can apply to that. So number one, it doesn't become redundant. And number two, it can be most effective based on the available audience who's listening at that time. Chris says, we're a Christian station, and we talked about how she was someone's grandma, mother, aunt, and how the royals were maybe feeling like we have all felt at one time or another. Yeah, awesome.
Great.
It's taking something big and making it small, which is what Seinfeld did for so many years, and making something personal. Another question that came in advance is, in one of the seminars, you talked about the power of getting one more listening occasion, but I can't remember the formula. Can you go over that again? Because it seems like teasing is what you're talking about here. And it is. Teasing is designed to get current listeners who already like your show, already like your radio station, to consume more of it. Kind of like a sign that's up beside the freeway. It's an ad. They're trying to manipulate you into stopping and buying a bucket of fried chicken or a sandwich or a coffee. They're trying to get your money, but at the same time, to that driver who's on the freeway and I'm hungry or I'm thirsty, that's a service. And so teases are a lot the same way. It's almost like a programming guide for your audience. They like what you're doing. Help them get more of what they've demonstrated they like. So the formula is this: in radio today, the average time spent listening per occasion in metered markets, studies show that it's no more than 9 minutes. I believe that it's closer to 7 minutes. That data was about 2 or 3 years old when it said 9 minutes, but there's a lot of evidence now that the average time spent listening is about 7 minutes. The average number of tune-in occasions per day to a morning show among P1 listeners, and P1 listeners are those who listen to your show more than any other show, the average tune-in occasions per day is 3. and they're not necessarily consecutive. They're all over the place. They might be a quarter hour here, a quarter hour there, a quarter hour another place. So they're getting 3 tune-in occasions per day, and the average number of days per week that they tune into your station averages 2. It's actually about 2.1, 2.2. But so if you do the math, the average P1 is tuned in 3 occasions per day and 2 days per week. So they're giving you 6 quarter hours per week in listening. Now, with a really effective teasing strategy, doesn't it seem reasonable that you can get people who already like you and have demonstrated that they like you to listen 1 more quarter hour per day and 1 more day per week? So what's the impact of that? If you can turn 3 quarter hours per day into 4, and you can turn 2 days per week into 3, 4 times 3 is 12. 12 quarter hours a week is double 6 quarter hours per week. You've just doubled your ratings. And you can do that just with a teasing strategy and using some of the things that we've talked about here today. Boyd says, hey, Tracy, how does the art of the tease integrate with social media? Great question. Andy, Mike, how do you apply it? And Andy is a lot more socially aware than Mike and I are. He's kind of our social media go-to on this.
Ironic. That was one of my notes I was going to mention is because sometimes teasing can be a little intimidating for on-air talent, especially when they start out. And that's why some of them don't do it at all, or they just do really generic versions of it. But it's such an important skill to learn because it translates well to, I mean, obviously, like you said, you're driving instant TSL when you tease on air, but you can also, you'll find the verbiage is only slightly different. And sometimes you can use the exact same verbiage on social media to set that listener appointment and drive cume. So learning, it's such an important skill to learn because you can take it to the other platforms and use it to drive, to set those listener appointments. The same goes for on stage. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people doing on stage intros in front of 10,000 people, and they say nothing that drives back to the station to set a listener appointment. And it's like, you got a show tomorrow morning, man. You know what some of the things you're going to do on that show. Use that teasing skill we've taught you on air and use it right there on stage. You know.
Yeah,
So
some of the most effective shows we have are using their social assets really well and teasing ahead. And they also use social to generate some content for what they're doing on the air ahead of time, particularly phone bits. So don't overlook social as a resource for what you're doing on air. Ideally, digital and terrestrial kind of complement each other. I used to call it closing the loop, so that we're sending them back to the radio station, and then we're sending them back to our social assets as well.
Yeah, I think you can also learn a lot from studying social media. Social media companies spend a lot of time and money in figuring out how to get that click from social media to their website, where they can monetize that engagement that they have with their audience
in as few words as possible.
Yeah, that's right. They have limited time. Because everyone has limited attention spans. And so, and you can see what clickbait is. Clickbait is when it's something that's outrageous and over the top, and you kind of say, oh, why did I click on that? But the really good companies are clever, much like the cover of a magazine is clever, that gets you interested in seeing what that story is about on page 71. Upworthy is a really interesting website. They do on social media exactly what radio shows do on the air. They look for content that is happening somewhere else, put a brand on it, put their perspective on it, curate it, repurpose it, and then market and promote it as their own. Isn't that what we do on the radio every day? We find things that are happening around us and we turn it into fresh new content. But Upworthy has a team of writers that go all over the internet, and they look for interesting stories to rewrite. It takes an Upworthy writer 15 to 30 minutes to find and write a story. But before they can publish a story, they have to first submit 25 teases. to an editorial board. They have to write 25 teases. It goes before an editorial board that meets once in the morning and once in the afternoon. They go through all of these stories and all of the teases. They narrow the teases to 10. Then the board votes on the 10 and gets it down to 3. Later that afternoon, they send an email to a portion of their database with a different tease for each story going out to see what gets the most clicks. That's what gets published the next day. They spend 15 to 30 minutes on the content and 24 hours on the tease. That's the importance of the tease, because if nobody gets to your content, you haven't really impacted anyone. So teasing is at least as important as the content. And you'll find a lot of media companies that are really studying this and working it on the internet and on social media are recognizing that. Another question, Y107 ads. I've been using a listener call with a little coaching to help set up a tease for big cash giveaways.
Love
That's
that.
great. That's a great entry point. And we're working with a couple of clients right now that are starting to use that, because one of the, and we're going to be doing this in an upcoming workshop too, about the handoff, that transition from coming out of a song and going into content, which is really awkward for a lot of personalities of how you get there. So you've just played a Garth Brooks song and suddenly you want to start talking about cats. I mean, how do you make that transition? So there's a handshake and then a transition into it. And you want to do that in a way that doesn't sound like you're that rude guy at a party who walks into a conversation and changes the subject. There's an art to doing it. And that technique that you just described is one of the things that is really, really effective. If you can set up a listener to say, hey, thanks for listening to Y107 today. How are you doing, Andy? And Andy comes on and asks you a question that leads you into what you wanted to talk about. It can be absolutely terrific. There's another technique that you can use in teasing. If you're doing let's say you're doing a phone topic, and you've taken a couple of phone calls. Before you take the third phone call, get that caller on. Have them say hello and say, you know what, I'm going to have to put you on hold. You got to hear what this story is all about. Let me just say this. It's about blank. Now you've made me taste it. It's like giving me a sample at Costco. I've got to get the full package. So that's also an effective technique.
Yeah, we have shows that have a serial benchmark, like well, I don't know, a second date update or whatnot, and you can take a very pivotal or interesting point from that and use that as part of your tease for the upcoming feature as well.
Okay, I've got one more question that is in the queue here, and if you have any more, okay, we got a couple more that I may have missed, but if you have any other questions, you can post them now on the chat room. Otherwise, we're going to wrap this up after answering a couple more here, but we'll stay on as long as the questions come in. So if you want to, just type it in the chat box and we will answer your questions. Question is, I'm struggling with a personality who thinks he knows a better way to format the morning show. He keeps stopping down to talk between songs, then segues into stop sets because listeners get used to hearing talk followed by commercials. So as soon as the talk starts, they know that they should tune out so they don't have to hear those commercials. What do you say to him?
Prepare a show further in advance.
When they start talking, they tune out. That's his premise, correct?
Exactly. That was my first thought.
Okay. Well, yeah. So that's interesting. We're going to break up two songs to have some talk. That certainly telegraphs something right there.
Yeah, and if you're talking adds value, then it's not a tune-out factor. That's the whole point of finding your angle and choosing content that you can actually add to. Is that talk is adding value. It's not a tune-out factor.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought when I saw this is, wait a minute, this guy is saying he doesn't want to talk into commercials because the audience will know commercials are coming up and they won't sit through his talk because of it. What does that tell you?
Right.
Maybe we have a content so he wants to put it between songs instead.
Right.
Something wrong with that logic. Bo Dalton, hey Bo, good to see you on. Says I write my teases, then walk around the building bouncing them off people. If they ask me
That's
to tell them
perfect.
what's the answer, I know it's a keeper.
great.
Great point. We use this technique. I learned this. I worked with a station in Detroit that was in a famous old building that was the ABC building back in the day when Jack Parr was doing his nightly Tonight Show before Johnny Carson. It shows you how old that was. And there were still some people working there that worked with Jack Parr at the time. And they said Jack Parr would come in at 7:00 in the morning and he would write his monologue for that night's show. And then he would just walk around talking to everybody in the building and practicing it with different facts. So he would walk up to somebody and say, "Do you realize I took a cab to dinner last night and it cost me $7 to get there? Isn't that outrageous?" And he'd see what kind of response he would get from the person. And then the next person he told it to, he would say it was $10. And he'd see if he got a different response. And he spent all day long walking around telling these same stories to different people. And he used different parts of his monologue for each. It was his show prep. And he could see how they responded if they kind of ignored him or acted like he was weird. And he would just fine tune that in his head all day. And by the time they went on to record the show that night, he was ready to go. It's a great technique, Bo.
Terrific.
Yeah, and if you're the further, not to keep beating the dead horse, but the further you work in advance, the more you can run that stuff by not only office work, you can run it by listeners at events if you're out on a remote. You know what I mean?
Yep.
You can also throw it up on social media.
Yep.
Write
That's
three
terrific.
teases,
Yes.
write 3 teases and put them out on Twitter at different times and see if you can start a conversation off the different teases and see which one ignites and which one doesn't. It's probably a better tease for the next day. Can you share your technique as to the order of the tease, like coming up next in the next hour, tomorrow, et cetera? Yeah, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of this. It's the shortcut. If you have content that's coming up after the next event, after this song, after this newscast, after this commercial, whatever, use next. That's coming up next after Dua Lipa on The Big Frog. If it's not next, but less than 10 minutes, tell me how many minutes away it is. That's coming up in 6 minutes. If it's more than 10 minutes, don't tell me how many minutes, because 13 minutes sounds like an eternity. 9 doesn't. If it's more than 10 minutes, but less than 15 or 20, timestamp it and say it's coming up at 7:26. By the way, you don't want to say at about 7:30 because nobody hears that language. It's so common that we keep hearing 7:30, 8 o'clock. So if you say it's at 7:26, it's 7:31, that gets heard better. So if it's more than 10 minutes, but less than 20, timestamp it to a specific time. If it's more than 20 minutes away, it better be really great content to be teased at all. And you'll want to put that into a different context. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be teased, by the way. It just means that it needs to be really good content or have strategic value to your brand in teasing it. And if that's the case, you can either timestamp it at a specific time or next hour at this time is good. And if you do that, then you want to associate it with what that listener might be doing at this time next hour. An hour from now, when you get to work, make sure you turn on the radio because an hour from right now, here's what's going to be happening, that kind of thing. And then the other timestamp is tomorrow at this time, which is actually much more effective than most people give it credit for, which is another reason to plan your show further out in advance. If you know what you're doing tomorrow, Elvis Duran did this one time and I'll never forget it. He was going into a phone topic about kids and about disciplining kids. And before he took the phone calls, he said, hey, you know what, tomorrow morning at this time, what would you do if your 4-year-old came home from daycare and said, I need a boyfriend and I need one now? That actually happened. Your calls on that tomorrow at this time. But right now we're talking about how you discipline kids when they misbehave. He just timestamped something and he did it with content that was similar to what he was talking about now. So it was awesome.
Timestamp those social media posts too,
Right.
when you're doing that the day before.
Yeah.
You know,
But think about lifestyle too. To Tracy's point, coming on at 6:05 and teasing to 9 o'clock. Unless it's really big, a lot of listeners, lifestyle wise, may not be able to listen to you then. I mean, listening patterns are different. So Don't think that you can, stretch somebody or get somebody back if it's not going to fit into their natural lifestyle.
And Mike, that brings up a good point. A disturbing trend I've heard lately, and I don't know why it's making a comeback, but is what I call the multi-tease, where people come on, especially with their first break of the day, and they tease everything coming up on their show that day. And then sometimes they'll go an extra step and tease everything coming up on the other folks' shows later that day.
Yes.
Have you heard that, or am I the
I
only one
hear
hearing
that all the time, and it
Yeah.
drives me crazy because it doesn't take into account the audience's experience and how I'm listening to the radio. It's your first break of the day, but it doesn't mean it's the listener's first break of the day. You just started your show. Who's that relevant to? Only to you.
Right.
It's not at all relevant to someone who was already listening and liking the station before you came on. And by the way, there's very few people who say, oh, you know what? It's 6 o'clock. I'd better turn on the radio because it's time for the morning show to start.
Right.
They don't listen the way that television shows do. And I think that teasing technique started when you watch TV, because television does a very good job of teasing. And a lot of times when a late night talk show comes on, they'll say, hey, we got a really big show planned tonight. We're doing this, and this. Well, it's a different viewer experience than the listening experience is to the radio. You're tuned in to watch something. And you're tuned in you're tuned in actively to watch something, as opposed to passively having the radio on in the background. So coming on with that laundry list at the beginning is really a complete waste of time. It doesn't.
Nobody's listening with a notepad taking notes.
Yeah.
And you talk about
Other than us. Yeah.
You talk about conditioning an audience to tune out. They are completely conditioned to tune out when you start talking about things that I don't even know what I'm going to be doing at 8:30 this morning. Are you kidding me?
Right.
I'm gonna plan on tuning in your radio show at 8:30 this way. Sorry, I'll go get it on demand sometime. Now, Andy mentioned multi-teases, and we call those stacked teases when we work with talent. And stacked teasing can be very effective. You can tease 2 or even 3 things at one time. And there's some principles for stacked teases that are good practices. You don't want to tease the same things. You don't want to tease 2 phone topics. You don't want to tease 2 contests. You don't want to tease 2 songs. Pick one, but you can then promote different things. Promote an information element, promote a phone topic, promote something funny. Now you've got a chance to hit 3 different types of audience interest at one time. So yeah, you can stack teases, but don't stack teases and tell me everything that you've got going on in the next 4 hours of your show. You still want to apply what's coming up next, what's coming up in the next 10 minutes, what's coming up in the next 20 minutes. You still want to apply those principles as well. I see no more questions in the queue, so I think we'll leave it there, guys. Thank you so much for being a part of our first workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
This was fun, and we'll all be on demand. And our next workshop will be on purposeful meandering and topic grazing, which is a great topic for coaching personalities. Thanks.